All right, hello everyone and welcome. Today we're going to do a deep dive, a real critical look at a fascinating study that sits right at the intersection of AI, virtual reality, and mental health. We're going to unpack a paper that asks a really big question.
So think about this for a sec. Can the way you speak, not just your words, but the rhythm, the pitch, the tiny pauses you take, could that actually hold objective clues, real biomarkers for depression? Well, that is the incredible idea a team of researchers decided to chase down. So let's get into it. Now, to really get why this research is such a big deal, we've got to look at how things are done now in mental health diagnostics. For years and years, it's been about conversations, about questionnaires, but something new is on the horizon, a totally different technological approach. What's so interesting here is the fundamental problem this slide points out. On one side, you've got the classic methods, and they're hugely important, don't get me wrong, but they are subjective, right? They depend on someone being able to accurately tell you how they're feeling, and that can be tricky. But on the other side, well, that's the promise of these objective, data-driven biomarkers that an AI could maybe, just maybe, pick up from things like your speech, not just the words you use, but the prosody, which is really just the music of your voice.
You know, this whole hunt for objective markers, it's the main goal of this really exciting field called computational psychiatry. The big idea is to use some serious computing power to find these subtle patterns in data that a human might totally miss, all to help doctors make better, more accurate diagnosis.
So the big question is, how do you even test this? Well, our guide for today is this paper right here by Gomez Zaragoza and her colleagues. They cooked up a really clever experiment to see if an AI could actually hear these signals, but in a setting that felt more like a natural conversation.
Okay, so here's our game plan. We've talked a bit about AI's role. Next, we'll jump into this virtual human experiment. Then we're going to put on our critic hats and analyze the methodology, check out the results, and finally, wrap it all up with some key lessons for you on how to read scientific papers like this. So how in the world do you collect natural-sounding speech for something as personal as depression? I mean, you can't just follow people around with a recorder. The solution this team came up with was pretty brilliant. Use AI-driven virtual humans to create a controlled but casual conversation. Here's how it worked for the participants. First, they filled out some standard questionnaires to get a baseline for depressive symptoms. Then came the really cool part. They had 6 different, totally open-ended chats with virtual humans. And get this, each virtual person was programmed to have its own emotion, like happy or sad or just neutral, to see how people would respond. And of course, every bit of data, the audio from their voice and the text transcript was recorded for the AI to chew on later. And this diagram just lays out the whole tech pipeline perfectly. So on the left, you've got the person talking. Their voice gets captured and split into 2 streams. One stream looks at the raw audio, the acoustics, the prosody. The other stream turns the speech into text and analyzes the words themselves. Both of those streams then get fed into AI models that are trained to make one decision. Does this person's data look more like the control group or the group with depressive symptoms? Okay, now we get to the most important part of analyzing any scientific paper. A cool idea is great. A clever experiment is fantastic, but the real story is always hiding in the methodology. As students, as future scientists, this is where you have to put your focus. Look, every study has its pros and cons. The big pro here is just how innovative it is. Using virtual humans to get people talking naturally is an awesome idea. It's way more real-world than a stuffy clinical interview. But we have to balance that against some pretty big cons. A sample size of 101 people, that's really small for machine learning. And this is the big one. The depressed label didn't come from a doctor. It came from a score on a self-report questionnaire. That's a huge limitation we absolutely have to remember. This chart shows you exactly how they split people up. The PHQ-9 is a common screening tool, and the researchers used a standard cutoff of 9. So anyone who scored higher than that got put in the depressive symptoms group, which you see in blue. But look at the spread. It's not a clean break, and a questionnaire score is just not the same as a full clinical diagnosis. And here are the numbers on who was in the study. You can see the final split was 59 people in the control group, 42 in the other. The gender balance is pretty good, which is great to see, but that overall sample size, well, it's still a major thing to think about when we ask if these results would apply to everyone. All right, so with all those methodological asterisks in our minds, let's get to the results. What did the AI models actually find? Was it the sound of the voice or the words themselves that held the key?
The best model they built, the one that used both speech and text data, got an F1 score of 0.648. Now, what on earth does that mean? Well, an F1 score just measures how accurate a model is. A perfect score is 1. A score of zero point 0.5 is basically a coin flip. So 0.648 is, it's better than random guessing for sure, but it's a long way from being ready for a hospital. This table really tells the story. Just look at this. The model that only used text, it was barely better than a coin flip, at about 0.5. The speech-only model did a little better, up to 0.566. But the best result by far came when they combined both signals. That tells us that while the acoustics of the voice seem to have the strongest signal, the words you use still add some important context.
And that leads us straight to one of the paper's biggest conclusions, right here. In these casual chats, it wasn't so much what people were saying that signaled depression, it was how they were saying it. That prosody, the music of their voice, was the real star of the show. These pictures are, wow, they are so revealing. This is a visualization that tries to group similar things together. So on the left, you can see the AI is pretty darn good at grouping people by gender based on their voice. The red and green dots are mostly separate. But now look at the right. When it tries to do the same thing for depressive symptoms, it's a total mess. The blue and purple dots are all mixed up. This just shows you, visually, how incredibly hard this problem is. And the researchers found something else, something that is so critical when we talk about AI fairness. Their best model actually worked noticeably better for male participants than it did for female participants. This is a massive finding. Does depression just sound different in men and women? Or is there a bias baked into the AI itself? The paper raises that question, and it's one we absolutely have to answer.
So after all that, what's the bottom line? Well, for all of you learning to read and understand academic research, this paper is just a perfect case study. It teaches us 3 huge lessons on how to really think like a scientist.
Lesson 1 is simple. Always question the methodology. The idea of using virtual humans is futuristic and cool, no doubt. But the tiny sample size and using a questionnaire instead of a real diagnosis, that means we have to be cautious. We can be excited about the idea, but we have to demand stronger evidence before we really buy the conclusions.
And lesson 2, limitations are not failures. In fact, a good scientist will always tell you exactly what the limitations of their work are. The authors here were totally upfront about the small sample and the questionnaire issue. That doesn't mean we throw the paper out. It means they've given us a clear roadmap for what to do next. Get a bigger, more diverse group of people with real clinical diagnoses. And finally, lesson 3. We always have to remember that technology is a tool. Even if this model had a perfect score, it wouldn't be a depression detector. It would be a tool to help a trained clinician, to give them more data to go along with their own expertise and their human judgment. AI is here to help, not to replace the human element of medicine. And that leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. This kind of technology is only going to improve. The models will get more accurate, the data will be easier to collect. So the really critical question for all of us becomes this. As AI gets better and better at listening, where do we draw the ethical lines? What should we, as a society, be comfortable with adhering? That's a question worth thinking about. Thanks so much for joining me for this analysis.